Okay, so I was invited to do a project at the ICA, and the show is called Everything That's Alive Moves. And I knew I was thinking about, after a year in Rome, thinking about monuments and memorials. I was thinking about my work in general, how I'm always trying to like conflate or complicate or wrestle with complicated histories, and what would it mean to kind of layer them together or kind of reveal them at the same time. So I was thinking I wanted to do something that dealt with definitely histories and memorials, but what would it mean to bring monuments and memorials, things that should be outside, inside? But I first started off thinking that the site of the ICA in West Philly is 3 miles away from the MOVE bombing. So I knew that was a place I needed to start. So I don't know if you know about MOVE. It was a group of Black liberation it was a Black liberation group, and they had over many years problems with the police, from casual annoyances to some of the members being accused of killing the police, shooting a police officer, which was false. Some of them spent like 40 years in prison. But I started thinking about this one incident that happened on May 13th, 1985. The day before May 12th is Mother's Day, and they were issued arrest warrants, and the people in the neighborhood were told they had to evacuate that day, on Mother's Day. What followed was the city of Philadelphia, the police decided to drop a bomb on the compound of the MOVE members who did not come out when they were told to. And then the famous line was, "Let the fire burn." It led to 11 murders, 11 deaths. 5 of them were children. So I knew I wanted to do something that related to that, but I didn't want to stay in the pain and the horror of what happened. I kept thinking about the day before, which was Mother's Day. And that led me to Ann Jarvis, a Virginia native who moved to Philadelphia. And she led the national charge to make Mother's Day a national holiday. In 1907, it was eventually a national holiday by 1914. And she decided she wanted to be the flower that would represent it would be the carnation. The red carnation was her mother's favorite flower. And in a lot of Black churches, my church growing up, on Mother's Day, if your mother's alive, you get a red carnation. If your mother's passed, you get a white. But red carnations are also part of, it's like the funerary flower in Jamaica. Carnations, you could think of them in terms of prom, but I kind of thought of what would it mean for me to have this carnation, and instead of you getting the pin when you enter the gallery, you get this carnation. So I wanted to be on one level that you're thinking about Mother's Day and what that symbolizes. I was also thinking about, I was researching that memorial that you see throughout Europe. It started in Germany, where they create these brass plaques, these stumbling stones that are put in front of the homes of Nazi victims who were killed in the Holocaust. And that is actually considered the most dispersed monument and memorial. And I was thinking about what does it mean to have this memorial to kind of exist throughout a country and throughout Europe and throughout the world. And I was thinking about what I can do with this piece, the idea that we're in the gallery together, and in that time together, it could be a celebration, but it's also acting as a memorial. But then when you leave, it kind of disperses as well. And I was also thinking, what would it mean for this to be a monument, but it's also ephemeral? So I was thinking about the material, what does it mean to have a monument that's not solid, that's not permanent, that's going to actually dissolve over time and kind of dissipate? And so I was thinking about those kind of issues, and I was thinking, what would it mean that we're a community, and then all of a sudden we kind of go off, some people go back to Philadelphia, some people visit from New York. So what would it mean for it to be dispersed? But I was also thinking about, when I was thinking about memorials, I was also thinking about the Wailing Wall and things like that. So then I did this piece called Wall a couple years ago. It was a much smaller version of this piece. And in this space, I decided I wanted to get rid of all the walls. It was important for the pieces in the show that you could always see something in the periphery. It was important for you to kind of see everything, because especially since I was building this wall. So we took away all the existing walls, and I decided to actually literally make a wall. This piece is called Fortify. And I had 5 people were working on it with me over the course of 2 weeks. So it kind of changed its look. Like when I did it on my own, the smaller version, it was all of my hand in it, but now it kind of took on this life in the composition of this collective. So the piece is comprised of bricks, and instead of the traditional mortar, the clothing becomes the mortar. All the clothing is used clothing, and that was really important to the piece, that it had to be things that had been worn. You could smell them, you could see the labor or their use. But it was also kind of like this beautiful composition, it was this beautiful painting. I was interested in how the piece was this abstraction from afar. You could kind of enjoy this abstract painting. But then when you got close, you were very aware of like the individual. So this anonymous becomes very individual. And you kind of see like these little pieces of paper. This is very deliberate kind of reference to the Wailing Wall, where I had these little pieces of fabric. But I like the idea that this clothing, the clothing is tethering it. You feel the tension. I was thinking about how, what does it mean to have a wall that's a barrier? It's a barricade. It talks about who has access, who doesn't. I was thinking about walls. I think about the Berlin Wall that separated families and ideologies for so long. And then you realize that wall was ephemeral like everything else. This thing that was supposed to be permanent, that's supposed to kind of separate, it was able to be dismantled pretty quickly. So I thought about this imposing wall and how in a way it was built brick by brick, but very in the same way it could be dismantled brick by brick. So you kind of this experience of having this intimacy with these objects, with this clothing, and you can't not think about the haptic and the kind of like the corporeal qualities to it. So then once you have this experience, then you turn around to the back and it's a very different experience. There's also this thing when you were standing close to it and kind of like, all of a sudden it felt as though it wasn't stable. Like you're kind of aware of its, it almost felt like it was, there's movement to it. So when you go to the other side, like this is heartbreaking. Like you think about, like, of course, I started thinking about this piece a couple of years after Trump was in office, and thinking about his wall and what does it mean about the kind of like the violence. I think about the refugees. All those things were kind of part of me thinking of this piece. So you come to the back side, and it becomes this almost like this wave, this cascading of all this material. In a way, the clothing, of course, became like a surrogate for the body. It's a pretty hard experience when you see it. It's kind of like your heart kind of sinks to your stomach. And I'm sorry that many people didn't get to see this piece, because it really is a very visceral reaction you have to it. So during my time in Rome, I was kind of obsessed with Obelisk. And I was thinking about the history of obelisks that came from Egypt. You know, they were put in front of the temples, the pharaohs, they were used in front of the temples. It was their way of having this connection to Sun Ra, the god. And I was thinking about how, you know, these obelisks were made at this certain location. Then they were kind of taken down river, and they stood for millennia at their locations. And then you have the Roman Empire, and they were actually stolen as trophies of war. So I was doing all this research about obelisk, and I was thinking about what would it mean for me to make my own obelisk, my own monument, thinking about obelisk coming from an ancient Black culture. What would it mean for me to make one? But what would it mean for me to make one that's out of cardboard, out of shipping boxes? So all of a sudden this monument that's normally solid, permanent, impenetrable, now it's hollow. It's made with cardboard boxes, which refers to like contemporary shipping. And then I covered it with Roman dirt. So I did this piece, and it's in parts. And I decided, I thought I was going to actually have this sculpture and kind of make a cast version in Philadelphia. But in the end, it made sense for me to move this, kind of take on the history of the movement of the obelisk and its history through time. So I decided, no, it makes sense for me to move this obelisk to Philadelphia. So I ended up doing a video, and it's too long. I'm not going to show the video. I'll just show some stills. But I can always post the video. It's on my website. And I was really trying to weave these histories of like the Egyptian history, the Roman Empire. I was thinking about the Middle Passage, the rise of capitalism, Philadelphia's history. I mean, Philadelphia is a Greek word for a city of brotherly love. So I was thinking about all these things. So this video, I was weaving these different histories together. So it starts with like the opening scene is, this is from my studio in Rome, July 2019. The past must address its present. So I was thinking about the idea of the past always being tethered to the present, and the present being dependent on the past. Let me just move this. So I'm just showing a couple clips. These were carved from one long horizontal piece, so from the bedrock of a quarry. So in a way, my video was almost a procedural video. At the same time, I was trying to, so I'm actually doing the act of taking it apart and putting it back together, but also kind of weaving the histories. The Egyptians were the original recyclers. Kings in their hubris demand that previous signatures of power to be chiseled away and removed. So you see it being taken apart, then it's being created, and it's going off to be shipped. I decided not to have imagery of it kind of during its passage, and decided to have these two videos, one of the Mediterranean Sea that talks about their life in Egypt. So obelisks were mined near the banks of the Nile. They traveled down river to locations where they stood for millennia. Then they crossed the Mediterranean to the shores of Roman emperors as trophies of war. And then I was thinking about juxtaposing that with the Atlantic Ocean. Years later, special ships will be outfitted to carry obelisks across the Atlantic to the New World, but not before the onslaught of European ships steered again by greed and conquest, outfitted to carry millions. The water is an element of which remembers the dead. So of course, I'm making reference to the Middle Passage. So then it comes to Philadelphia and his truck, and then I continue the narrative. The stone dragged from the quarry to a dry dock on the Nile waited the season when the waters would rise, allowing the next leg of the journey downriver. Then I was doing all this reading about Sojourner Truth. I can't get into, there's so much history, but there was a quote from Sojourner Truth saying, when I left the house of bondage, I left everything behind me. I wanted to keep nothing of Egypt on me. And she's referring to when the Jews were the slaves of Egypt. So it's an interesting thing of thinking about blacks, Egypt being this black culture, but at the time when we were kings and queens, we had slaves. I thought it was an interesting thing. So I was trying to weave these different narratives in it. And then I was thinking about Egypt being this like land of, you know, of our kind of black conquest, but also what does it mean that we were the oppressors? So I was thinking there are two Africas for us, Africa, Caribbean, which Africa is ours? And it continues. And then I was thinking about what does it mean for these obelisks to be displaced? The fact that there are so many there in this country. So I was thinking about them being the widely displaced, a stranger in a strange land. And that kind of comes from a James Baldwin quote. And the end of the video, you see it, and I actually had to cut it down to fit in the space. Indeed, the past is only the past because there is a present. The past, or more accurately, pastness is a position. So in the show, I installed this other piece called Car Cover and Export Shoes. And this is a photograph I took from when I was in Dakar. And I was interested in this photograph where the car cover, the car is not being used. I'm not sure if it actually works or not, but the idea that the car cover now becomes a display for shoes, for selling shoes. And I think about being from Trinidad, and there's always a repurposing of objects. You know, empty parking lot becomes a site where you can have a fete. The sidewalk, again, is a place to sell things. So I was thinking about that history. And when I decided to create this piece, I had two things happened. Hurricane Harvey happened, and I was listening to this program on NPR, and they were talking about this one nonprofit charity that instead of giving people donating goods, they actually gave people debit cards. And I remember hearing this woman say, I don't need more bottles of water, I need money to fix my roof. And that led me to thinking about the developing world and the third world, in quotes, where our complicated Western complicated relationship to patronage, our complicated relationship to charity, and the thought of like, what does it mean that our kind of imperialist country and the European imperialism and colonialism kind of created the situation in a lot of these parts of the world, but it's our strange relationship to consumerism. But I was also thinking about that photograph that went viral, that refugee, that toddler was on the shore, and that red shoe, his shoe that was on the side. So I was thinking about these different things and decided what would it mean for me to take a car cover and fill it with export shoes. And export shoes are the shoes that, okay, go to Salvation, you donate your things to Salvation Army, people buy them. The things that no one wants, they end up boxing them up and they ship them to most of the time to countries in Africa. So I was thinking, what would it mean for me to have those shoes that would be normally going to that place to fill this car cover? It made me think of like who has access to public transportation, and you can't not think about right now with COVID, you know, who are the frontline workers, who are the folks who still have to be on the bus and the trains. So I was thinking about like access. I was also thinking whenever I think of like genocide, you think about like the violence. It's always like you see like that shoe, like someone for a shoe to be just stranded. It's a drastic situation. So what does it mean to kind of feel this? And I was thinking about this piece also. It kind of has an interesting relation to the wall. The wall you dismantle and you kind of have to take it down brick by brick. It's like a slow process. While this, you take off that car cover and it's like this cascade of the shoes fall down. So there's a strange tension in it. I chose this car cover because it had this license plate so people would realize it's actually completely filled with these shoes. So in the show, every 22 minutes, there was a sound of this church bell. And it's 30 seconds. And I wanted this church bell, I wanted something to puncture the space. I wanted something to kind of mark it. I was thinking about how church bells, you know, in times of war, they're used to call people together, to gather, to kind of, to gather and kind of be ready. So I was thinking, what would it mean to have this church bell? Of course, I didn't mind its relationship to religion, but I was thinking, what would it mean to be this kind of call to arms, or a gathering, or a way for us to kind of, we have to kind of gather and be together and take care of whatever is necessary. So the final piece, this is a piece I did at Socrates Sculpture Park, and it was a very different piece there. There I was thinking about, it was a sculpture park. I was thinking about different kinds of parks. I was thinking about amusement parks. I was thinking about what does it mean to make a carousel that only has one chair, that takes 7 minutes to make one revolution. It's missing all the lights and bells. What does it mean to make a carousel that's this sparse carousel when normally you think about an amusement park, it's a real bombardment of your senses. It's like the point is to kind of bombard your senses to where you lose yourself. So I thought, if I make the reverse, I make this thing so sparse where you're faced with yourself. But I was thinking this show was, a lot of it was about how I can make this work. How do I make all these works kind of speak about or in relationship to monuments? How do I make them all how do I make them relate to the different, to displacement? Or when I think about monuments, I think about displacement, I think about absence, I think about invisibility, I think about mortality, I think about beauty. And I was thinking, what can I do with this piece? So when I realized in a way, it was also like, this could be just a monument to kind of a childhood, but I had no idea that it would actually take on this really intense role. It actually became a witness. It was like the witness of the, if you can imagine atrocities, it became a witness, and it was like the stage, it was almost like this place of honoring what was around. All of a sudden, the carousel became like this body, this entity that kind of recognized the absences that were amongst all the fullness of the space. I'm going to just play a little video just to give you a sense of how it moved in the space. This is from sitting on the chair. We'll go a little fast. So it was this strange thing where you felt like you were alone on this island. There was the canopy above you. You felt kind of sheltered, but you felt kind of separate. And there was a strange thing about the slowness of the movement was slow enough. It was different than if you were sitting still in it, because in a way you could kind of just get caught up in your own thoughts, but there was a slowness that was felt very deliberate and intentional that made you pay attention in a way that you may not have at a different speed. And I wasn't expecting it to be take on this role of the witness, or to bear witness to it. And in the background, you're hearing the video, and then every 20 minutes or so, you would hear the bells would go off. So it kept shifting how it functioned, this carousel. But then it was also joyous. I mean, it's a carousel. So there was also like joy, and kids just knew what to do. Kids were like playing on that space. So kind of, I liked how it kept on shifting kind of psychologically and emotionally and kind of politically and culturally and how it functioned. Okay, so that's the end of that show. I'm gonna just show some public works and we'll go till you tell me to stop. Okay, so I was invited to be part of this show at Real Art Ways. It was a show on contemporary Caribbean art. And I decided to do a work outside of the museum. It's the 4th largest Caribbean community, so I thought, let me just do something in the neighborhood. So there was a Caribbean grocery store, and I decided I wanted to put a library there. I kept thinking about my relationship to Trinidad. I was born there. I spent all my summers there. I feel very tied to my culture, but I started thinking about how my education is decidedly American, how little I had, how few books I'd read as an adult that were from the islands. I started thinking about what would it mean to have, okay, there are all these signifiers for culture, like the food, the calypso music, the carnival, all these things that make me feel like I'm still tied to it. But I was thinking about books, and I was thinking, well, what would it mean for me to put a Caribbean library in a grocery store? I'm thinking about the store it's actually trafficking in nostalgia for home. I was thinking about what would it mean for, you're going there to kind of relish, and to kind of hold on to like, the nostalgia for home or the dishes that you love, and kind of like that sensual experience. But what would it mean for, books to be the kind of the non-perishable produce of our heritage? What would it mean for you to kind of revisit things you've read? So I kind of organized the library according to the things sold in the store. So that what you're seeing there is like all jerk sauces on that wall. So those are Jamaican titles. Political titles were among the hot pepper sauces. This was like a personal thing. My mom starts preparing our Trinidad black cake, our Christmas cake in December. So I put it, the main thing is in December, she has to start like soaking all that candied fruit in with rum and wine. So I put the Trinidadian titles there. The smaller islands, I put by the beans. That was like my own absurd humor. Guyanese titles were here by some of their products. The children's books were by the cookies. The Haitian titles were by the Haitian soft drinks. This was the cultural books. So you'll have it by things that are really, really kind of been around in different parts of the Caribbean culture. So you'll have these ancient medicinal tonics, these woodroot drinks. But then you'll also have drinks coming out of Jamaica called Bedroom Bully, or Stallion. So I thought it was interesting to have these culture books in this position, which shows kind of the expansiveness of the culture and things I don't necessarily like about Caribbean culture. But I thought it was important to have them kind of represented there. And it functioned, it was like, you take the book out, there was no like date of return, you take the book out, and when you're finished, digesting them, you bring it back. Like any library, some books didn't come back. The show was up for about a year, and then they lost part of the space and they had to give it up. So the books ended up going to the community center down the road. And I was interested in like what the shifting kind of poetry of it, like skin folk hard dough, like how that kind of keeps shifting and what kind of the poetry of that. And this is, kind of how it functioned. I did the piece again a couple years later, like 5 years later in Toronto, and it was a very different store. It was a very compact store. I decided I had to change the titles. So, there was new books that came out. I had to be a lot more selective. I had to change to some like Caribbean, Canadian authors. I had more Jamaican titles to kind of reflect the demographics. And I'm hoping I could do this piece again and maybe in Miami, where I could do something maybe in Little Haiti or in some like in Cuban neighborhoods. So I was thinking about, so hopefully that can happen in the future. So in 2017, Ken Lum, this amazing artist, and Paul Farber, this historian and academic and artist, I would say in a way, decided to have this exhibition. Well, it started a couple of years ago, but they had decided to have this big citywide exhibition in Philadelphia called Monument Lab. It brought together 20 artists in 20 different sites, the public squares, plazas, historic sites in the city. And the charge was to come up with what would be an appropriate monument for the city of Philadelphia. And we were asked to kind of create prototypes. And I like the idea of them being prototypes, this idea of a proposition or a possibility or like the what if. I can imagine, even though we all made physical things, there's the idea of thinking about what is possible monuments. And I mean, it's kind of, this is a moment for monuments right now. And it's kind of, it's interesting because people are kind of like showing up, some of the images are coming up of things that happened in the past, but it's interesting how it was still relevant then, how as much as it is relevant now. So I was interested in this park near my home. I live about 5 blocks away, Vernon Park, a historic park in Germantown. At one point, that neighborhood was the site of, during the Revolutionary War, where the White House was. The only Revolutionary War battle that was fought in Philadelphia was fought at this site. So this is a monument dedicated to Francis Daniel Pistorius, a German settler in the neighborhood. He is a Quaker. He led the first Quaker protest against slavery in 1688, so almost 100 years before it was abolished. I found out that during World War I and II was boxed over. The look was, the thinking was that the look was of the monument was too dramatic. And it has a kind of echoes today with, it's so complicated, but we can talk about that maybe in the question and answer period. So in the center of the park, situated kind of in the center, is the Battle of Germantown Memorial. So this is, again, the failed battle led by George Washington. Of course, it speaks about who gets to have a monument. You know, George Washington, even though it was failed, he's an important figure. So I was thinking about, so you have Francis Daniel Pistorius, this German American fighting for Black Americans. You have George, in one time period, you have George Washington fighting for America's freedom from British rule while owning slaves. And I was thinking about the paradox and complexity of that. I was also thinking about the 16th century talking statues of Rome. There were these 8 statues throughout the city where people would post notes. There was notes people would post that were kind of critiquing the government, critiquing the religious authorities. Sometimes people would write a note on one and the response would be on another one. So I was interested in this idea of these statues being like a multiple authors, shifting conversations, different histories. I was thinking about that, kind of creating this conversation between these two monuments. So I decided to transcribe the history of the Daniel Francis Pistorius Monument onto the George Washington Monument. So I boxed it over the way the Pistorius Monument was in years past. And I thought it was going to be simple enough to do that, but then I thought it wasn't enough. I thought, what would it mean for me to mirror it? So box it over and mirror it. So now the idea of a monument, the problem with monuments often is that the materiality makes them feel like they're permanent. It makes it feel like they're stored. Their history's like, the history is it's finite or it's absolute. It doesn't leave room for the new discoveries that are on the earth. I think about the problematic with monuments where, because of their material presentness, they often feel like they can do the memory work for us. They don't feel like there's room for us to see ourselves reflected in. So what would it mean for it to be mirrored? If it's mirrored, I become the monument. I become the keeper and protector of democracy. What does it mean for it to be mirrored now in a way, all of a sudden, depending where you are in the part, it was invisible. It was installed a week before the Charlottesville, the neo-Nazi rally. So all of a sudden this peace battle is joined, became kind of like a call to arms. I was interested in its invisibility. I wasn't interested in necessarily taking down this monument. What would it mean for it to kind of be in dialogue with the Confederate monument debate? I was thinking about, what does it mean for you to pass by this monument? It's a neighborhood park. You pass by this monument 100 times and maybe you don't see it because you're used to seeing it every day, but maybe you don't pay attention to it because you think it has to do with someone else's history that has nothing to do with your own. What would it mean for it now to never be sitting still? All of a sudden, there's always a usual dependency on the y-axis, the verticality, the reference to look up. All of a sudden now, it's reflected, what's reflected behind you is in front of you and up and below. All of a sudden that gets conflated. all of a sudden now it's no longer about a single perspective, and often monuments they give you the single perspective that's supposed to stand in for the universal, which we know is false. So I was thinking about all these different things that happened. I mean, lots of things happened. I remember when I was installing it, there was a guy who was really upset. He's like, people are starving here and they're spending like thousands of dollars on this piece. And he's like, don't you know people are starving here? And I said, of course I know people are starving. I live 5 blocks away. I live in this neighborhood. But are you saying that because this is an economically depressed neighborhood that we can't have art here? Does it mean that we're not worthy of this? Does it mean that we can't see ourselves reflected in this beautiful can't see ourselves reflected in this beauty? And I ended up like stopping my install, and I was just talking to him for hours. In the end, he kind of totally agreed. Like, we had a really long conversation about it. But things happened with this piece. I mean, there was a vet who I'd see every day, definitely an alcoholic, definitely still traumatized, definitely still having PTSD. And one day he came up to me and said, I had to kill that woman and child. I'm a Marine for life. It wasn't me. He was, something about that monument allowed him to share something really painful. Prayer circles happened around this. Of course, selfies and all those things happened, but like serious things that I could never predicted happened around this. I went to a poetry reading, and this poet started reading a poem, and I realized it was a poem that was a response to this piece. She's also the poet Tripita Mason, who actually, I love her voice. So she's the one who narrates the text that I wrote for the video. So I'm going to play that, her poem now.
Monuments of Brown Voice. The artist installed a mirror over the monument, and the people have come to gawk. Rubberneckers wonder what was there before, and you have come too, laying in the cut, statue still for seconds. Your reflection edging off a 20-foot high bronze looking glass. You are an alluring hunk of stone beguiling me. Yes, you, brown boy, rough cut, monolith. I see you. You are a low-slung jean-wearing grandmother greeting pillar, an obelisk marking the entrance of your hood. You need to be somebody's memorial, not only when you laid out and lowered in the dirt, your pillow a marble headrest of past tense, he was, he once, he lived. No, you are now and present, alive and in color, and you need to be somebody's walking shrine, somebody's testament, somebody's tribute in this city. You have to be carved, stretched, and erect, a column to buttress boogeymen, the phantoms they say you imagine, the specters and goblins who told bullets and policies and laws that encase you. You need to be somebody's memento. Look how you beaming off that seeing glass. I'm catching your shine. Look at that swagger you carrying, hoodie wearing, fresh fade having, full teeth grinning. You need to be somebody's something to fight for, somebody's celebration, somebody's stone turned monument, carved and smooth, our masterpiece in this city.
So I was asked to be part of this project that Creative Time sponsored in Central Park. And it was a strange thing of thinking, like, what am I going to do in Central Park? I mean, the last big art project there was Christo back in, when was it, the 90s. And I decided to just, again, I was thinking, I don't want to put something new there, like kind of like it's already there, kind of like the monument. Like, I could use what's already there. So I decided to make this billboard, this lenticular billboard, which was kind of presenting 3 periods of time of histories of that location in the park. So this is an image of a glacier that was representing the Wisconsin glacier that went through New York City 20,000 years ago. So when the ice sheet melted, all the kind of formation of the landscape, the rock outcroppings, all of that was kind of determined by the glacier melting. And I was thinking about how when you're in the park, you may not realize what you're seeing is a result of that 20,000 years ago. Like, it's there before you, but you may not think of it, even though it's in plain sight. So the second image that it flips to is this fragment from a plate from Seneca Village. Seneca Village was this, I would say, a middle-class community of free Black folks in Manhattan, in the area of Central Park, like from the 80s. And later on, they were established for about 50 years. Towards the end, there were some German folks living among them and some Irish. When they decided to build Central Park, they claimed, there's like the first claiming of like the right of eminent domain. And they were scattered wholesale throughout the city, and kind of very little evidence is left of the Tennessee in the city. So I thought about having this plate that speaks about, like, I was thinking about, I wanted something that was tactile, something that would kind of, one, speak about class, but it also is the idea of like the intimacy of this plate up against that glacier, the kind of the larger than lifeness of that glacier. The third image was of the site right there behind it. So depending where you were, like if you're across the lake, you know, kind of went from like seeing the glacier, then you see the shard, and then you see the landscape behind it. And I was interested, what does it mean to kind of, the person walking kind of is kind of controlling time. I was also interested, what would it mean to kind of, when things get juxtaposed, the landscape behind, but also you see this plate and this scale of it. What would it mean to kind of position the larger than lifeness with the intimacy and to equate those two? What would that mean? What does that mean to do that? I was also thinking about, depending where you're standing, if you come really close, it was conflating. So what does it mean to kind of conflate 20,000 years of history in this site? And I love this piece because it just kept shifting. And it made me think about like this, the linear but non-linear nature of history. Or I think about like when things, like we know, like things are understood, but then what happens when something is spotlit or something is revealed? How does that change the arrangement of what we presume to know when new things are unearthed? So I'm going to talk, this might be, maybe this might be the last thing I'll show. And this has been in the papers recently. And I wrote an op-ed about a Washington op-ed piece a couple weeks ago, and there was a coverage in the New York Times. So University of Kentucky, Memorial Hall, there's a New Deal era fresco by Anne Rice O'Hanlon, a Kentuckian who was, at that time, a lot of those murals were to show the actual landscape and kind of the history of that time. And in this case, kind of like the development of the industrialization of Kentucky. So it's been at this, it's ebbed and flow in terms of people have been debating and protesting it, I would say for 30 years now. It shows a sanitized version of history. It shows a sanitized version of slavery. There are a lot of problematics with it. I mean, there are interesting things. I'll go back. She does center those 4 slaves in the center, and literally you see the railroad on top of them. So there was some acknowledgement of the state, or the country, was built on the backs of Black folks. But then you have things where the stereotypes, and I thought this was interesting, this couple standing there with this guy with the gun. But then you'll have, you know, the only Native American represented kind of looks like he's forced to attack this white woman. You have, you know, the Black musicians having to play for the white elite. You have the boy up in the tree denying access to the performance venue. So the president decided to cloak the mural for about 1.5 years and have the community within the institution, but also in the community at large, determine what they should do with it. At the time, the idea of taking it down was not a possibility. I think about the intersectionality of that. Like at the time when she made that mural, it was like the largest mural by a woman. But how do we deal with the fact that, but there was also, she was portraying racism and stereotypes in the mural. So they decided, let's make a work that's in conversation with it. I was chosen, and at first they wanted me to do something in these 2 kind of, that big vertical niche. But then when I went to the space, I'm like, but there's a dome ceiling. And I was thinking about dome ceilings and what does it mean to have a dome ceiling in a space for higher education. I think about dome ceilings they're from like prehistory, they're from Islamic cultures. You can find this. So I was thinking, what does it mean to have that there? So I thought, okay, and the vestibule has this dome ceiling. Maybe I should make a piece that kind of deals with that access, looking up, knowing that the next room you enter, across the whole expanse of the room is a horizontal mural. So I decided to take on the whole thing. There were these 4 medallions I decided to activate, and I also painted that whole section of the space, and it's kind of a color that's kind of an aggregate of the stone below. And I decided to paint, to remake all the black and brown figures from the mural and scale them up and gold leaf the ceiling and place them there. So now these figures that were anonymous, these figures that were subjugated, these figures that were only seen in the context of whiteness now can exist outside of whiteness. I was thinking about gold leaf being a very complicated material. I think on one, of course, you can't not think about the Byzantine and Renaissance churches on the way they become saints. I was also thinking of them as constellations. I was also interested, because it was at a school for our higher education and it would have repeat viewings, I thought it'd be a good thing to have a material that's complicated like gold. We know that gold was stolen from sub-Saharan Africa, so it's a complicated material. Gold, you could think about what does it mean about gold being the equivalent of this commodity, the way blacks were commodities as well. But I thought it was a place where we could kind of wrestle with and kind of interrogate and kind of go in there and deal with it. So that's happening there, and it was kind of beautiful. It was like it's a breathtakingly beautiful piece. Around the base of the dome is a quote by Frederick Douglass: "There's not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong from him." That came from that July 4th, a famous July 4th speech he gave. There's a guy, this horse carriage driver taking a rest. I kind of positioned him next to this slave with a sickle, kind of hoping you think of this kind of surreal, maybe violent moment that could happen as he floats down. I kept calling these group at the train station the witnesses. And the piece I called it witness. I wanted this word that could be both, like it's a noun and a verb. So what does it mean for me to kind of witness this and have to kind of wrestle with the complications? In the 4 medallions, I put representations of 4 under-recognized Kentuckians. This is Georgia Davis Powers. She was the first Black woman to represent Georgia in the Senate, and she did a lot of work with anti-discrimination laws. This is Chief Redbird, who lived peacefully among the white settlers. He was murdered by 2 Tennessee men. They were never brought to trial. Peter Durrett, at the time of his death, he was a slave. By the time of his death, he was free, and he started this African Baptist church. At the time of his death, I think it was the largest congregation of a church. I think it was interesting that I had to use a Black silhouette, which actually was a popular form of representing people at the time, but it speaks about who gets to be in the archive. Because he wasn't white, he wasn't of a certain stature, there was no representation of him, so I had to the fallback was to use the Black silhouette. This is representing Charlotte Dupuy, who at the time her slave owner was the Secretary of State, Henry Clay. So when he went to the White House, when he came back after serving, she refused to continue being his slave, and she was arrested. So this is a precursor to the Dred Scott case. So yes, I was hoping, I kept thinking, what would it mean for me to have this piece that would I guess ask people to, I was clear that I didn't want a piece to answer any questions. I wanted to kind of, in the James Baldwin way, the role of the artist is to ask the question the answer hides. I was thinking it's at an institution, so what would it mean now for this piece for them to have programming around it? What would it mean to kind of have it be part of the curriculum along with other works? How to use this work as a catalyst or a tool? How could it be used as a space for discourse, a space of polemics? How do we kind of deal with treat it like a living work? They're both in a way contemporary works because we're kind of dealing with them in the present. How do we deal with the challenges of it? And you know, the whole George Floyd and all the uprising and all the obvious monuments that we know should come down. Like we all know the Confederate monuments have to leave the public square. Christopher Columbus should never have been there. But I remember, the reason why I wrote the Washington Post op-ed, I had heard how HBO was pulling Gone with the Wind, and they were going to bring it back once they create the context for it. Language, I can speak, this is a racist film, and I'm thinking, oh, there are works what are all works that are problematic from the early 20th century? Do we get rid of them all, or could some be used as a tool? And I was thinking that this is one of them. So I was thinking about that, and then the president of the university, and this piece has been, problematics. The president of the university announced in July 1st that he was going to tear down the fresco. And I thought, this is such extraordinary times. This is not the moment to do that. This is the moment we have to think. We have to kind of work through. Like it seemed like these symbols have meaning, and they're imbued with, there is some power in them, but the real work that the faculty, because a lot of the Black faculty were saying they didn't want this to come down because they were actually using it. They're like, the real problems that are happening in the school, there aren't enough Black faculty. There's lots of problematics. Like this was the easiest thing to do, and in a way the least long-term effective thing to do. So it's still being debated. Like right now the piece is supposed to come down, but the National Coalition Against Censorship is involved. Wendell Berry, the famous poet, who's kind of the most esteemed alum they had, sued the university. His wife's aunt was actually the muralist for the piece, and actually something about it being made on state land in a way, there's a ruling that they can't tear it down. So this is actually being litigated right now. But I think we'll stop there because I think I've spoken a lot. I wanted to show this project I did at a former convent and a prison in Italy, but I think we don't have time.